Hey everyone, this is Calvin B. Fisher, author and YouTuber. I'm here with Orion, who is gracious enough to join me to do a little interview and conversation. We thought it would be fun to kind of just go over science fiction in general and Dead Space and talk about the science fiction horror media as well as why there aren't quite as many games like Dead Space out there. We talk about whether Dead Space is truly this unique experience and just what maybe could be done in the future to get more games like this. With all that being said, I'm here with Orion.
Yeah, hello everyone. This is very exciting for me personally since this is my first ever collaboration on YouTube. And I know that might sound weird because I've been doing this for almost 2 years now, a little longer than 2 years, and Kelvin here is my first ever collaboration that I've done on my channel. And it's definitely crazy, but I think there's no more perfect topic to discuss with this collaboration than with Dead Space. And I'm just really excited to get into this discussion, man. Let's hop right into it.
Awesome, sounds great to me.
So yeah, I think based on the idea that we came up with to do this discussion with each other, so what it is about the IP of Dead Space that makes it so interesting, but also at the same time that makes it so weird that we don't see more sci-fi properties do something like a Dead Space more often, considering it is such an not an original idea and not but the concept in terms of what it is that Dead Space is. It's basically the idea that the human race comes across aliens, and basically nothing goes right when the humans mess with the aliens themselves. And we've seen in the past and in the present that many different movies, video games, and even books for that matter have delved into this kind of thing. But overall, when it comes to the more modern time, we don't see too many do this kind of thing that much anymore. And there's probably various amount of reasons for that, but I think Dead Space is a good example to talk about because obviously up and coming now, we have the remake for the original game from 2008 coming at the end of the month. It's the first big video game of 2023, and it is going to be basically a way to not revive the franchise, but maybe bring it to a whole new set of eyes who maybe never played the original game before. And I think it's really going to make people appreciate this franchise, especially since I do think that this game is going to be a good one. I've been studying it for a long time. I think the developers have a lot of passion in this project, and after having played the first original Dead Space myself for the first time this past Christmas break, I am I'm definitely going to put a lot of time into this game, hopefully, when it releases in less than 2 weeks now. So, overall, what do you think about the concept of Dead Space, Calvin? I think with regards to how more science fiction properties don't really do something like this nowadays, with regards to any different type of entertainment media.
Right, what I think is so interesting about Dead Space is just the fact that it is a science fiction horror video game, which really isn't that common in the industry. And I think a big reason for that is because of how the sci-fi genre traditionally conflicts with the horror genre. And what I mean by that is generally science fiction is more associated with power fantasy in sort of escapism in that sense. If you think of other video games in that space, such as the Destiny or Mass Effect, right? You're sort of this all-powerful being who has a lot of powers, a lot of times the chosen one. And just with a lot of futuristic technology, I think a lot of times there's this urge to explore those enhanced abilities and possibilities in the future. And when you think about traditional science, when you think about traditional horror, it's all about stripping power away from the player, making them feel vulnerable, making them feel scared. And I think that's one of the most impressive things about Dead Space is if you look at Isaac Clarke in the first game, right? He has the trappings of science fiction. You see he has abilities and powers such as being able to levitate things or freeze things in space using futuristic technology, while at the same time, he feels like a very vulnerable person. And I think having to kind of walk that tightrope of making a character that feels both powerful and also really vulnerable is something that I think a lot of developers don't want to approach. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dead Space is such an admirable franchise. And that ability to kind of walk that tightrope, I think, is one of the reasons it feels like such a unique horror game to play.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You know, you bring up that idea of the power aspect and what it is that most different entertainment media franchises latch onto, which is this idea that, especially with something like video games, you mentioned a game like Destiny. I've played both Destiny games, and for me personally, I did enjoy both games equally. I don't think one is particularly better than the other, but the point is that those games, from a science fiction perspective, and the way that they tackle that genre, it's obviously very specific in terms of the type of game it is, because Destiny is a first person shooter video game that delves into PvP and PvE type gameplay. When you look at a game like Dead Space, obviously it's very different. It's single player driven, it's story. Obviously there is multiplayer, but that doesn't come until Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3 is, as far as I'm correct and as far as I'm aware. The original game was just solely single player, nothing more, nothing less. And you talk about a character like Isaac Clarke. I think when I look at an original game like that 2008 Dead Space, I think the character of Isaac, while I agree with everything you talked about with regards to his character in terms of like something like his vulnerability and his ability to survive and make it feel like you're there with him, I definitely think that that's something that could go a long way if we saw it more so in more modern science fiction properties, if they were to delve into this type of storytelling in these types of worlds where you handle such situations as to where you are playing as a human who comes across an alien who creates an outbreak that you have to fight off, that you have to kill, and that you have to escape from. And I think overall, I think more games would do better if they did touch on these types of these situations, these circumstances, these different types of survival instincts that people would definitely have in themselves to want to conquer if they were involved in something like space. And so I think with how much entertainment I've consumed over my life with regards to sci-fi and with regards to tackling an area like space, it definitely gets tricky. But overall, I wanted to ask you something, because when it comes to Dead Space, I think what makes this franchise so interesting is that it does something that I feel like only video games would do as well, I shouldn't say as, but much better than most other different types of entertainment media, like books, like movies, for example. I think when you see movies tackle this kind of thing, they don't do it as well as they probably should, and maybe that comes down to practically or in some other manner, but in your mind, do you think it is mainly video games who should focus on this type of thing, or do you think at some point in the future more passionate developers of movies and authors of books, they should tackle this kind of thing more so because they think that there is an area to explore this kind of thing that is not so heavily focused in the video game industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm a bit biased, I guess, as someone who writes books, but I think the field is sort of wide open for people to sort of tackle these sorts of settings in both novel form in movies and in video games. I think what's really unique about the video game format is that even if you're playing a character like Isaac Clarke, because you're the one controlling him and he's the avatar you're through, that when enemies attack you or things jump out, there's this primal sense that you know that it is you being attacked, right? You have the responsibility to control Isaac and get him out of these dangerous situations. And I think that's sort of something unique about video games, is how much you can immerse yourself in the main character and almost forget about who you are outside of the game for, the hour or two that you play. In contrast with a book, let's say, where as you're reading, for instance, I've read a good amount of Lovecraft last year, which kind of deals with cosmic horror, which is kind of related but a little bit different. And is as scary as a lot of those stories can be and cause food for thought, you never have that same feeling of truly feeling like you yourself are in danger. And I think that ability is something that I think more games should take advantage of. And I'd love to see it more in a science fiction setting, because aside from just the scary idea of monsters in space and the idea in Dead Space where you're trapped in this space station, which is one of the scariest ideas when the vacuum of space is out and there's nowhere you can go. I think also science fiction presents a lot of really cool opportunities to kind of look at morality or just the advancements of technology. Like, it'd be really cool to have a game like Dead Space where they're dealing with these space monsters, but let's say there's also, you throw in almost like a Deus Ex feel where there's these human upgrades and stuff, and then you have to kind of grapple with that of what it still means to be human if your main character's, getting rid of their arm and strapping on a robotic one to fight the monsters better. That's just sort of me spinning at the concept, but I think there's a whole lot that can be done, and video games have a really unique opportunity, and I think have certain strengths that other media lack.
That's actually a good point, Calvin. I honestly do agree with you in some cases in that reasoning. But I also think that, like, especially when you look at something like movies, for example, there was I can't remember how long ago it was. I want to say it was either a month or 2 months ago, where there was a quote that came out from famous filmmaker and composer John Carpenter, where he said that he would absolutely be down to, I think, not only make a musical score for a Dead Space movie, but he would also be down to direct it. I might be wrong on the directing part, but I know for a fact that he said he would absolutely do the score for a Dead Space movie if a movie were ever created out of that property. And when I come to think of something like that, first of all, not only does it get me intrigued, but it would also get me excited. But there's another part of me that thinks practically, would that even remotely be possible if it's done in the realm where, for example, the film would only be done through CGI purposes? Because when we look at many different science fiction properties, and specifically when it comes to film and television over the years, recently there has been this idea that there needs to be a reasoning to delve more into the CGI and visual effects area more than doing it practically. And understandably so, in fairness to a lot of these developers and these movie filmmakers and TV show showrunners who make these kinds of things, they are put in a tight spot because of the fact that space is not a practical thing that any one person can just go up there and film something to make it look more real and more practical. A lot of that stuff does have to come from CGI and the ability to use visual effects. Yes, there are certain times where the practicality of something can come into play and make it look a lot better. But overall, when I look at something like Dead Space, the reason I think something like that works so much better for a video game is because there is so much involved in the story of Dead Space that makes it feel like it might be too much to try and do that and make it feel like it's resonating off of the original games. And that's why I think that from a video game perspective, I think Dead Space, sadly, probably should only stick into this realm. Now, from what I hear, there are movies that have been made out of Dead Space, but having not done any research on them, I'm going to take an assumption in saying that they are all animated, which would make more sense because, again, when we're talking about a practical style, it's much more harder to do. When you're talking about showing off these necromorph creatures, which by all accounts, there are many different versions of, that would be very hard to do in a practical sense. And to me, I'm somebody who thinks of seeing something practically. Some of the times, it's way better to look at than if it's like a visual style like thing where you're creating the necromorph out of completely all CGI. And so when I think about something like that, it's a little tricky to delve into. And so that's why I think if you as a science fiction author look at this type of thing and say, well, maybe it could be made into a movie, but also it would probably just work better on the other different media types like books, like video games. Like, do you think that remotely in any way, shape, or form, it could be practical in the future that a series or a movie could be made out of something like Dead Space? It would cost a lot of money, and I think lots of studios just probably wouldn't make that decision. But do you think there is a possible chance that something like Dead Space, or anything that resembles Dead Space, could be practical enough in the future to do?
Yeah, I think one of the tough things about Dead Space is it is such a setting-focused game as far as I think the USG Ishimura is just as much of a character as Isaac Clarke or Kendra or whoever else. And one of the great joys of the game is exploring the ship and seeing the different areas. When I think chapter 6 you're going through and you're seeing the greenery where all the food's being grown for the ship. And there's all this kind of world building that goes on during that, which goes into immersing you. And it's hard for me to think of how you could take that experience of Dead Space, which is one of the most defining parts, and condensing it into a 2-hour movie. I suppose a TV show would be a little bit easier as far as the spacing and timing goes, but sort of to your point, I think the budget required to do that correctly is more than a TV show would be allotted. So I think it's definitely possible. I think with Dead Space it would be really hard to do right just because of what the series puts emphasis on. I think if they took a kind of similar concept and did it with a wholly new original concept, I honestly think it would stand a little bit better of a chance of succeeding just because they could take the pieces of Dead Space that would really work in the film format and really key in on those. If they did that same thing with Dead Space itself, I think it runs the risk of kind of losing those things that makes Dead Space special. So it's one of those things where I'd love to see it on the big screen, but there's that sort of part of me where knowing what kind of goes into writing books, and I've written a couple of screenplays myself, of how much would need to be cut, I think it would be a monumental task.
Yeah, no, those are great points for sure. And to kind of echo off those points that you're making there, in talking about the idea that we both came up with regards to having this conversation, this idea that why don't more sci-fi properties do something like a Dead Space? I think you kind of just nailed it on the head. It's like it's a monumental task. It's something that would take studios and TV showrunners a big step in the process to make something like that. Obviously, nowadays, I think we can definitely agree that it's more possible now than, let's say, it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But when it comes to the budget, it would take a lot of money. And also, in terms of how you would able to do it correctly enough to where it resembles the game. I mean, listen, we've seen plenty of video game adaptations not work well in various different forms of media, whether that be TV shows, movies, or even books for that matter. A lot of the times there are different types that just don't translate as well in one form of entertainment media to another version of entertainment media. It's all based on how you write it, how you film it, how you do this or that. It doesn't matter, or how you design it in a video game. So essentially, when we talk about something like Dead Space and the idea around what makes Dead Space what it is, I think that overall, we can definitely see that this is why more of these types of properties and why more of these original ideas, because I think you can definitely say that Dead Space, while there are parts of it that are not as original in themselves in terms of like the monster aspect, the boss fight at the end where you fight this big giant alien. Like, we've seen stuff like that before. Not a lot of that stuff is as original as we've seen in the past with other various properties. But I think when it comes to coming up with newer ideas, for example, like one of the more recent examples that I'm coming up with, and to be clear, this is probably not the best example to use, but there was a movie that came out around 5 or so years ago, I want to say, called Life, with Ryan Reynolds, Hiroyuki Sanada, and Rebecca Ferguson, and a bunch of other actors, about how they discovered an alien while on the space station up in space, orbiting the planet. And the whole gist of it is that it's this contained idea of these astronauts who are stuck inside the space station with this alien creature that they discover, and they have to survive it as best as possible. That is an original idea that I think we don't normally see a whole lot of. Obviously, the space station, that's not original. That's something we've known before. The astronauts, that's not something that's totally new. But it's the concept of taking the alien part and putting it inside the space station with those astronauts, with those old concepts that we know of already, that makes it more new and original. And so with Dead Space, it was kind of fascinating because it's a highly futuristic setting based with aliens who create monsters that we've never seen before, like these necromorph creatures that are so disgusting and wildly like crazy monsters that just want to kill you at every second and are very hard to kill. And so with regards to the storytelling aspect, with you as somebody who is an author and wants to make stuff like this in the science fiction genre, do you think at some point it would be best to communicate with more authors or more storytellers in general, no matter what the entertainment media is? Do you think it is better for these people to look at something like Dead Space and maybe take something from it and kind of make new original ideas that are as not as related to Dead Space as some might think it is, but just more original in the sense that it branches off Dead Space and we can see certain parts of it that make it so original and so appetizing to go and look at?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the greatest tools an author has in his toolbox is just going out and experiencing the other great works of art that people before him have created. I think Dead Space itself is a great example of that. I recently watched an interview of the game director, Glenn Schofield, and he talks about how the biggest inspiration behind Dead Space was Resident Evil 4, and you can see a lot of that same DNA in there. And I think originally when he was pitching the idea to investors and publishers, he described it as Resident Evil in space. But as you can see from the final product, Dead Space is an entirely different game than Resident Evil. And I think sort of through that, Dead Space is such a rich game in its environmental storytelling, in the plot, and just how it integrates its lore into the story through the audio logs, and just how that all melds together teaches a lot of great lessons to writers on how you should build these worlds, how to make them convincing, how to have a main story that's compelling. So I think, absolutely to your point, Dead Space is a great place to start and a great way to find ideas of what story to tell, but also I think how to tell that story well.
Yeah, that is. I think that's a good point, and I was actually taught to kind of piggyback off your point. I was just talking to somebody about Resident Evil 4 in my most recent video, where we talk about that new trailer that came out for the Dead Space remake and how this idea of remakes that make basing your story off other different properties in the past. Like you talk about how Glenn Schofield kind of compares Dead Space to being Resident Evil in space. And in a way, he's honestly correct. He's not wrong in any way, because especially when you look at a game like the Callisto Protocol, for example, which I made a lot of videos on, and I even made one video where I talked about the fact that the Callisto Protocol is essentially Resident Evil, but also the Alien franchise mixed into one with a new original concept. And so I think a lot of these games, while they carry off of other franchises and the ideas they have, which, by the way, is not a bad thing. I think most of, if not everything in science fiction has based itself off something that came before. You know, like how everybody talks about, for example, how Star Wars based itself off Dune, and how a more recent movie like Top Gun Maverick is essentially just Star Wars A New Hope with regards to the trench run on the Death Star at the very end when you have all the fighter jets going to blow up the uranium factory. It's a lot of things base themselves off each other. And with regards to something like the Dead Space remake, well, first and foremost, let me ask, you're definitely going to be playing the remake, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think when we look at the remake, hopefully it can add a lot more to the story itself, because when we look inside the story of the original Dead Space, it definitely does harp on a lot of, and I know we'll probably talk about this a lot, but Resident Evil for sure. It's just this idea that there are bigger powers inside of the story that lost their minds. They thought way bigger of a picture than most others would think. And they went so mad to the point where it causes this outbreak on this ship, and essentially it leads them into this area where they think they're the good guys. They think that they're not doing anything wrong. They want to cover it up. And overall, with regards to doing this type of story in science fiction, do you think it's something that might get overplayed a little bit too much now as we go further on throughout the years, as we get more science fiction storytelling? Because if you really think about it, you really do see these types of stories get mainly told in the sci-fi genre, and in the fantasy genre for that matter as well. A lot of the time you do see that more so in here than, say, like any other different genre, like the horror genre or the comedy genre. I mean, you wouldn't really see that in a comedy, but it's mainly science fiction that takes a hold of those perspectives and those circumstances of these like evil corporations and all that kind of thing. Do you think that there's a possible future where that might go away a lot more than most people would think it would?
I think there's always the risk of oversaturation. But what I always come back to is when I look at the zombie subgenre specifically, how I always think that the genre is about a year away from kind of going the way of the Western and the cowboy, where people are so sick of zombies that people stop watching things. And you hear that all the time of people are like, oh, another zombie movie or another zombie game or another show. But then you look, and for instance, one of the most hyped shows right now is The Last of Us coming out really soon. Um, and that's sort of basically a zombie thing. So I think there always is with genres the risk of oversaturation and kind of tiring your audience out. But I think there's usually in those kind of tropes and concepts something about it that really gravitates to people. So if you take that trope or that genre convention and really do something unique with it or speak to it in a powerful way, I think people will still be drawn back to it. It's kind of like, going back to the Western, people say that's kind of a dead genre, but then you have Red Dead Redemption 2 come out and sell gangbusters and be the highest reviewed game of the year and win a whole slew of awards and that sort of thing. So I think that these genres, um, I think things that are cliche and kind of don't do anything unique with it will get washed away, but the pieces of art that truly speak to something really human and something that has something unique or novel to say will always kind of stand out, even if they're kind of blustered up by these tropes that people have seen a whole bunch of times.
Yeah, honestly, you aren't you are just very on point with everything you just said there, because you do talk about this idea of oversaturation, and we see that with a lot of things nowadays. It doesn't even really have to kind of pertain to entertainment specifically. We see saturation in a lot of different areas. This video is going on YouTube, and YouTube itself is an oversaturated place now. And I think when we look at something like science fiction, for example, there's also a lot of oversaturation in there. Like, a lot of people, I think when they look at a game like the Callisto Protocol, they think that, oh, I've played this many times before. This is just Dead Space, but different. But also, it's still just Dead Space. And so it's like, I think with something like zombies as well, and it does. Funny enough, it does hurt me a little bit for you to say that zombies is probably going to go away very soon, because I'm somebody who has grown up with zombies in different forms and fashions in terms of how much I've consumed of it in entertainment, whether it be through video games or through movies and television shows. And, I myself am also going to go into The Last of Us TV show, like you are, in very soon here for the first time, because I actually never played The Last of Us. I haven't played the first game. I've never played the second game. It was at a time where I wasn't really too heavily into video games, or at least not yet anyway. I was kind of more growing up when those games came out, or at least the first one. And so I'm hoping that while there is this ability, because, and I want to actually kind of speak to you on this next question, because at least speak to you directly. This idea of doing things, at least from a saturation perspective, like if you constantly overdo something and it gets stale, I think there's this idea that I think somebody like you, as a new up and coming author who is going to hopefully write, new and awesome stories, there's this idea that people in their mind think that as long as you do something that might have been oversaturated in the past, as long as you do it in a way to where it feels like it's properly and well executed, it still wouldn't matter how much they've seen that in the past. It just has to be done well. So for you as an author yourself, are you hoping that as far as how you see the different authors around you, because obviously you want to write books, you want to write screenplays, you want to do all these different things. Are you hoping that from what you've seen in your life, from your point of view, that the more newer up and coming authors, and these TV showrunners, these movie developers, these filmmakers, these storytellers, they're going to be able to grasp onto this idea of creating new things that even if they did come from more overly saturated genres, they can still do well with them because they're trying to do something new while in something old at the same time?
Yeah, I think you spoke to a lot of it as far as, quality, I think is just the most important thing. There's a lot of things, at least me personally, I've experienced reading or watching where it's a story I've heard before, but it was done just with so much artistry or just so much into the characters that the fact that these tropes exist, they kind of fade into the background as you get immersed into the story. And I think, I guess reeling it back to Dead Space as far as that goes, during the game when I was playing it, I was just so immersed in the world that I almost didn't notice a lot of the tropes being used they kind of went right over my head up until I went back and started writing my script and, thinking more about it. And I think that ability for fiction to kind of just take you and absorb you inside of it is just one of the reasons I think there's this resiliency to tropes being kind of overdone and overplayed. And kind of along with that, the reason tropes exist, I think, a lot of the time is because there's something inherently satisfying about them. For instance, you could say the hero's journey is overdone. I mean, it has been done thousands upon thousands of times. We could all kind of recite the hero's journey by heart, but yet hero's journey stories are still ones that we resonate with, and I don't think that they'll ever go away because there's just something it just hooks so much into the human spirit through that. And I think just, yeah, as an author, one of the most important things is to just tap into something that's human and make something that resonates with someone, because if you can make a piece of art either through the characters or a compelling plot or a number of other things and just make it resonate with them, that's going to stick with them a whole lot more than, I guess, more of a literary analysis of, has this trope been used? How often has it been? I think once the quality of a story starts to degrade is where people really kind of can see behind the curtain a lot better and see all of the tropes and the moving parts that make a story a story.
Yeah, that is a very interesting way, and one that I don't think you hear too many people talk about with regards to that idea and that overall viewpoint on how you carry about the story, how you carry about the different types of storytelling beats that you might have seen before in a past IP, but you would bring it over to something else different in the future, like after that original idea had come from the past. And kind of delving into, I think, the final question I wanted to ask you, and it's actually based off the video that you made to where is how I found your channel, and that is the video called Dead Space Critique and Retrospective, a Masterclass of Sci-Fi Horror. And included in that title is the idea of science fiction horror. Do you think there is a possible future now, especially with this notion that we know that the horror genre itself is still doing very well? I mean, if we look at movies, for example, recently, the most recent Scream movie did pretty well. I know the movie was liked by many and not liked as much by others, but for the most part, lots of people did like that movie. It made a lot of money. We got a movie like Smile, which did very well at the box office. It was a new original concept and idea that people really loved and were intrigued by, so much to the point where they kept going and watching the film. And then we even get a film like Megan, which was the first big release movie-wise in 2023, which as of right now is making a lot of money. And it's obviously a new twist on the, evil doll, which we've seen before with the Chucky franchise. Obviously, this one is more different. They took a more original idea in terms of AI and robots and turned that into a doll who just happens to want to kill people. And so that's all really cool. And so it seems like the horror franchise, whether you like a lot of the what has been made in the horror genre, or whether you're just somebody who doesn't like scary stuff, you can't deny that genre, more than maybe any other genre, has stood the test of time consistently and has kept people coming back more and more. Do you think that there is a possible chance that in the future, as we see more new and original horror ideas come to the fold, and even ones that have come from previous franchises, do you think that there is a chance that if science fiction horror made a big enough leap into creating great pieces of entertainment media, that science fiction horror could be one of the best things that ever happened to any amount of entertainment that we've ever had? Because I genuinely do think that there is a chance that could be the case.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. I myself am not the area I gravitate more towards is science fiction. The horror parts of it with Dead Space are actually kind of new to me. One of my favorite games of all time, though, is Evil Within 2, which is another horror game. And sort of through those two principal experiences, I do think there's just a lot of movement to be made in the genre. One area I'm sort of flummoxed that we haven't seen much of yet, and maybe this is my ignorance and it already exists, is like a sort of Lovecraft horror space cosmic themed game. If you think of something like Dead Space and merging it with Bloodborne, I think there's so much room to do that. And going to your point about science fiction horror, I do think there's a ton of potential there because there's a whole lot of futuristic concepts. If you think of AI or cybernetics or just the internet and its progression in general, there's so many things that you can take about those concepts and turn them into something that would truly horrify people. I think in a very real way that could potentially also speak to, you know, social things or just the state of society and things like that. So I think there's a ton of ground there for the genre to kind of make both a lot of money as far as being appealing to people and scare the heebie-jeebies off of them, but also a lot of opportunity to kind of make artistic statements through it as well. So I do hope it has seemed like there has been a resurgence in horror and, you know, both the movies, there's been a whole bunch of success. Like you were alluding to, it feels like kind of the most consistent box office success outside of the superhero genre has been horror. And also with video games, seeing the resurgence of horror, right? Dead Space wouldn't be getting a remake if there wasn't interest in it. Resident Evil wouldn't be getting remade if there wasn't horror in it. And just the success, you know, I think last year of Resident Evil 8, there's just, I think, fertile ground for even more science fiction art and that sort of thing, especially in that horror genre. It seems like both are kind of booming right now. So I think it's a really exciting time to be either a fan of science fiction or horror or both.
Well, hey man, I honestly I couldn't agree more. I think when we look at the science fiction horror genre specifically, at least the subgenre of science fiction horror, when you combine both together, I think we're hopefully in for a great start to the year of 2023 with that Dead Space remake coming at the end of this month, less than 2 weeks away. We're 12 days away. I'm excited. I think we're gonna have a great start to the new year with in terms of big video games. So here's hoping for the best on that game. I can't wait to start playing it. And overall, I think that's going to end off this video talking with you. I think this was such a great experience and something so new for me personally, and at the same time so enjoyable to have this conversation and just sit down and talk with each other about science fiction, just Dead Space, and just everything as a whole in terms of where we could go in the future and how you personally see it, especially you being a science fiction author and somebody who could hopefully make great stuff in the future, man. So I appreciate you coming out and talking with me about this. This was awesome. And so I will hand it off to you to end this off for us.
Awesome. Well, I feel the exact same way. Thanks, Orion, for this opportunity to get together and talk about sort of our shared experience and joy in this genre and just kind of what we'd experienced both recently playing the Dead Space games and just where this genre's gone. So this was such a joy to talk to you, and I'm excited that I got to have this opportunity to speak with you. So yeah, with that being said, exciting things, especially for Dead Space in the future. I think for both of our channels, with I'm sure we're both going to cover the remake, and as well as sounds like Dead Space 2, you've got stuff cooking in the pipeline for that. Yeah, so thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a great time, and this is Kelvin B. Fisher signing off with Orion.